Your birth certificate records the date you arrived. It does not record that this date was already working against you. A study analyzing over 1.7 million patient records, published by researchers at Columbia University, found that birth month correlates with statistically significant differences in disease risk and lifespan across 42 documented conditions. You were born in a particular season. Your mother was therefore pregnant during a particular season, which means your organs were calibrated, dialed in, like the factory settings on a machine during a specific window of sunlight, infection exposure, and nutritional availability. That calibration is not a memory. It is still running inside you right now. I'm going to walk you through exactly which birth month carries the highest documented mortality risk and precisely why. And at the end, I'll give you a 3-part intervention called the Birth Debt Reset, a protocol built specifically to address the biological settings you cannot change but can absolutely work around. The science only makes sense if we start at the beginning. The invisible villain in this story is not a disease. It is a process called epigenetic programming. In plain language, conditions during fetal development act like dials on a control panel, turning certain genes up or down permanently. You do not alter the gene itself. You alter how loudly it speaks for the rest of your life. Most people have been told that genes are fixed and environment is what you control. That is incomplete. The dial setting happens before you are born, in a window that closes before you take your first breath, in response to conditions your mother experienced during pregnancy. And most people have never been told that the season of their development had a measurable and lasting effect on which dials got adjusted and how far. We've been told that birth outcomes are determined primarily by genetics and parental health behaviors. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, drawing from a landmark dataset covering Danish and Austrian populations across decades, found that individuals born in autumn live statistically longer than individuals born in spring by a consistent margin of roughly half a year, across populations with no significant differences in income, lifestyle, or access to healthcare. The mainstream framing of birth outcomes never mentions this. Half a year sounds modest. At population scale, it represents millions of person years of lost life. The spring disadvantage is not noise. It is a signal that has been replicated independently across multiple countries and multiple datasets. So which spring month specifically carries the worst statistical outcome? Based on the convergence of multiple independent datasets, including a 2015 analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, and corroborating data from UK and European population registries, May emerges as the birth month most consistently associated with elevated all-cause mortality risk in Northern Hemisphere populations. Not with certainty for any individual, not as a verdict, but statistically, persistently, across different countries and different research teams, May keeps appearing at the wrong end of the lifespan distribution. Here is why. Not one reason. 5. And they stack on top of each other the way compound interest stacks, except instead of growing wealth, each one amplifies the damage of the one before it. Number 5. The sunlight window closes at exactly the wrong time. A baby born in May was conceived around August, which means the critical organ formation months, the first and second trimesters, fall between September and February, the lowest UV months of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. The mother's vitamin D production drops sharply because vitamin D is manufactured in the skin through sunlight exposure. Most people think of vitamin D as a supplement for bones. That is the smallest thing it does. Vitamin D is a signaling molecule that regulates the expression of over 2,000 genes. It acts less like a nutrient and more like a master dial for the immune system, the cardiovascular system, and the inflammatory response. When fetal development happens in a vitamin-depleted environment, those 2,000 genes are being calibrated with their dials turned down. Cardiovascular risk is set higher, immune precision is set lower. Research published in the British Journal of Nutrition found that maternal vitamin D deficiency during the second trimester specifically correlates with measurable differences in cardiovascular function in adult offspring. The second trimester of a May pregnancy falls between November and February, the darkest months. The dials are being set in the dark. Number 4, the immune system gets its first lesson at the worst possible time. A May-born infant in the Northern Hemisphere reaches the 3 to 6 month window, the period of maximum vulnerability, when maternal antibodies are fading and the infant's own immune system is still assembling in August and September. That sounds safe. It is not. Autumn arrival means respiratory virus season begins exactly as the immune system is taking its first calibration reading. Pediatric immunology research has found consistently that early life respiratory infections during the 3 to 12 month window alter the developmental trajectory of immune maturation. The immune system does not simply fight the infection and return to baseline. It learns from it. An immune system trained on aggressive autumn pathogens during its first calibration period develops a different baseline than one whose first calibration happened in spring and summer. The long-term consequence is a slightly elevated inflammatory tone, a dial set a few notches too high. And right now, if you were born in May, that elevated tone is driving slow, silent damage to your cardiovascular system and your metabolic function. Not dramatically, steadily. Number 3, maternal respiratory infections during fetal lung development alter lung architecture permanently. The 3rd trimester of a May pregnancy falls between February and May, peak influenza and respiratory virus season. Maternal respiratory infections during this window do not stay contained to the mother. Inflammatory cytokines, which are the chemical alarm signals the immune system floods the body with during infection, cross the placental barrier and reach the developing fetus. The lungs of a baby whose development was bathed in high cytokine levels are not built identically to the lungs of a baby who developed in a low inflammation environment. Fetal programming research shows these differences persist into adult life as measurable reductions in baseline lung capacity. And here's the mechanism that connects lungs to lifespan. Reduced lung capacity forces the heart to compensate constantly for reduced oxygen delivery. Decades of that compensation compound into structural cardiac changes. The heart was never designed to run indefinitely at partial oxygen supply. The increased workload is invisible. There are no symptoms. The dial was set before birth, and the machinery has been working harder ever since. Number 2, the circadian clock is set at the wrong baseline. Light exposure in the weeks immediately following birth calibrates the infant circadian system, the internal timing mechanism that regulates cortisol release, sleep architecture, cellular repair, and metabolic rate. A May baby in the Northern Hemisphere experiences maximum daylight immediately after birth. Extended early life light exposure calibrates the circadian dial toward a summer rhythm, compressed sleep cycles, shortened perceived night, accelerated cellular activity. Research in chronobiology, the science of biological timing, has found that individuals with compressed natural sleep architecture as a baseline show higher long-term rates of metabolic syndrome, the cluster of elevated blood sugar, abdominal fat accumulation, and high triglycerides that precedes both type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. The circadian system is not a setting you can manually override by going to bed earlier. Its baseline architecture was established in your first weeks of life. You are operating on that setting right now. The dial was moved before you had a say in it. Number 1, telomere length at birth. This is the mechanism that matters most, and the one almost nobody talks about. Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of your chromosomes. Think of them as the plastic tips on shoelaces. Every time a cell divides, the telomere shortens slightly. When it shortens too far, the cell stops functioning correctly or dies. Telomere length at any given age is one of the most reliable markers of biological aging speed. And here is the finding that stops most people. Spring-born infants, particularly those born in March through May in the Northern Hemisphere, show measurably shorter telomeres at birth than autumn-born infants. Shorter plastic tips, straight out of the factory. The birth dial for cellular aging was set further along than average before the first breath. This is not dramatic at birth. But telomere shortening is cumulative. A small initial deficit, compounded by 40 or 50 or 60 years of normal cellular division on top of a shorter starting point, produces a measurably accelerated aging trajectory. By the time a May-born person reaches their 60s, the original deficit has been amplified by decades of compounding. This is the birth debt, and the people carrying it have no idea. Here is what this means for you, not as a verdict, as a set of biological targets. The birth debt reset is a 3-component protocol built to address the 3 mechanisms in this list that are modifiable. You cannot change your telomere starting length, but you can measurably slow the rate at which the tips wear down. You cannot reprogram the vitamin D calibration that happened in utero. But you can flood the 2,000 downstream gene pathways with enough substrate to operate at the top of their functional range. Component 1, circadian anchoring. A fixed wake time within a 30-minute window every single day, including weekends, combined with morning bright light exposure within the first 20 minutes of waking. Not because it feels good, because consistent light anchoring measurably reduces cortisol dysregulation. And cortisol dysregulation is one of the primary drivers of telomere shortening in adults over 50. 20 minutes of outdoor morning light, fixed wake window, 7 days a week. This resets the dial toward a neutral position. Component 2, anti-inflammatory load management. Not a supplement stack, a dietary ratio correction. Research consistently shows that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the modern Western diet runs between 15:1 and 20:1. In plain language, 15 to 20 parts of inflammatory fats for every 1 part of anti-inflammatory fats. The ratio human biology was calibrated for is closer to 4:1. Closing that gap through 2 to 3 weekly servings of fatty fish, elimination of seed oils from processed food, and if needed, a tested omega-3 supplement of at least 2 grams of EPA plus DHA daily produces measurable reductions in systemic inflammatory markers within 12 weeks. You are managing the heat that was turned up before you were born. Component 3, Zone 2 cardio. Moving at a pace where you can speak but would actively prefer not to. Not sprint intervals, not a casual stroll. The specific intensity where your body's mitochondria, the power generators inside every cell, are forced to become more efficient rather than just work harder. More efficient mitochondria produce less oxidative stress as a byproduct of energy generation. Oxidative stress is the primary chemical mechanism by which telomere tips are worn down between cell divisions. 3 sessions per week, 45 minutes each. That is the dose with documented telomere preservation effects in the peer-reviewed literature. One mistake that invalidates the birth debt reset entirely, treating it as an acute intervention rather than a chronic one. These 3 components work through accumulated exposure, not single episodes. 1 good week produces no measurable change. 12 consistent weeks begin to shift inflammatory markers. The biology is unforgiving of sporadic effort because the mechanisms it is addressing were built through 9 months of consistent environmental exposure before you were born. You cannot outsprint that with a good weekend. If you were born in May and you are starting the birth debt reset this week, comment May debt below. I want to see who is actually running this. Subscribe, because next week I'm looking at the birth month with the highest documented cardiovascular event rate, and the mechanism behind that one involves something that happens in the 32nd week of pregnancy that your cardiologist has almost certainly never mentioned.